Welcome to What's Your Signal, the podcast exploring new ways to connect people, places, and things everywhere. You're joined by me, Taylor Walker, and my co-host, Mauricio Stefan. Hey, Mauricio.
How's it hanging, Taylor?
it's every time you do that, I just don't, I don't know what to say afterwards. So I'm going to think about that for next time. And you're probably going to say something different and totally throw me off. But Mauricio, let's get serious for a second. We live in a country divided. And yes, probably for the reasons you're thinking, but also we're living in a time of a great digital divide where access to modern information and communications can really vary widely between demographics and regions. And that kind of divide is particularly troublesome in education. There's a substantial number of students that lack sufficient internet access, and ultimately that jeopardizes their ability to participate in online education or even complete assignments when they're not at school.
Yeah, as much as people tend to think of internet connectivity as a luxury, it's not anymore, right? Even, you're talking specifically about education, but even beyond that, and even into secondary and higher education, that digital divide becomes an extreme disadvantage from everything from learning to applying to jobs to just paying your bills to everything. And so, having that digital divide, especially in education, becomes a huge limiter to a child's potential in just getting them started in their educational journey and eventually into their career and they're off on the right foot.
Yeah. And if you're someone that has access to the internet, it's easy to think that access is everywhere. But according to the National Center for Education Statistics, in 2021, 22% of kids whose parents had less than a high school education did not have internet at home, which is just accounting for a small demographic, but a large percentage of children. And as remote learning becomes an even more integral part of education and advanced learning techniques require more reliable connectivity, cellular is really rising to the top as a way to keep these kids connected. And today we want to really dive into that. So we're going to explore the role of cellular technology in the classroom, no matter where the classroom is. Joining us to weigh in on the EdTech revolution is Kajeet's Director of Strategy, Jean Ballard, and Ericsson Senior Sales Engineer and Solution Architect, David Earp. So Jean, David, thank you for joining us today to chat about school tech. There's a lot to it. And Jean, I'd like to start with you to set the stage for this topic. Can you talk a little bit about, I've heard it referred to as the digital divide in education and kind of when that became a concern?
Yes, happy to. It's something I'm personally passionate about, and one of the reasons I'm with Kajeet. So when did it start? That's a tough question. I would go back to when the internet first started coming into schools, right? When we started seeing the internet used for mostly, I guess, back in late 90s, maybe mid 90s to late 90s, which I certainly remember. And then, obviously it became a it's hard to do anything, especially today in society, to be able to participate in society if you don't have access to the internet. And certainly everybody recognizes that, in whatever it may be, school, home, whatever. So I think that the equity started there. There's different kind of levels the way I see it, right? The first part was every school needs internet access. So some type of pipe to the internet, and it was set at a minimum speed to start with. Once that was achieved, and that is achieved now, every school out there has internet to them, right? Then it was, is there a computer lab where this entire school shares 10 computers? If you remember those days, I do. But and then it was like, every student really needs access to it, have a device with them that's one-to-one. They're at school. And then we started, and we're still sort of in this stage, depending on what school, getting rid of textbooks, right? So the physical textbooks that you lug around a big backpack, or doing away with those. And I always like to use that analogy too, where if you could imagine when you went to school and you got a textbook, everybody got a textbook. They didn't ask you whether your family was well off or not so much. And it's like, oh, wait, your family, you're poor, you don't get a textbook. And essentially, that's what we're doing today in society. Is we took away the textbook. We say your homework's online, or even if it's not homework, any additional study you want to do, any research you want to do is online, but we're not giving you a device, and we're not ensuring you have connectivity when you leave campus. So those are kind of the things. And talking out sort of in this part here, there's connectivity when you leave campus, right? The things that we consider, and a lot of this comes from COSA, which I'm a huge fan of. They're kind of the thought leaders behind, IT in schools, and certainly a big advocate of digital equity. But that's the Consortium for School Networking, COSA, organization, nonprofit. Anyway, they identify connectivity as one of the major things when you leave school. Do you have access to the internet? Hardware is second. Do you have something you can connect with, right? Are you doing homework on a phone with a limited data plan with their family sharing is not adequate at all. And certainly now isn't fast enough to speak. Then that's just two pieces. The third piece is teaching and learning, right? Do you have a curriculum built that's tailored for that environment? And we were moving that way with COVID, right? Where there was kind of a mutual thing, and you figure out how to teach when you're not directly in front of them, and the things you could do in the collaboration or using the tools to their full, ability. The fourth one is digital citizenship. Do you really understand what you should be doing online, how to do it, how to be a good citizen online? Certainly, we have some issues with that in society. And then the fifth is one that gets forgotten, is tech support, right? Before the IT guy would come down to your classroom and take care of the big projector. But now you have these things out everywhere. So how do you support them out in the field? And all of those are really equally important. And sometimes we only think about connectivity and hardware. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wouldn't have thought about some of those other things in that list. I'm really curious to hear from you guys. So what was initially done to maybe address the lack of some of these things? So the lack of connectivity, the lack of hardware, how has that been addressed maybe during the pandemic? How did that pan out? How is that starting to be addressed now?
Yeah. And the Creative Point certainly has helped with that. Stepping back and framing, before the pandemic, there was some acceptance that there was this digital divide, that there was this what they call a homework gap, right? Meaning you can't do your homework when you leave school. And some school districts, the vast majority, had some small cohort of devices that they would send out. However, those programs, if you think about it, and you're a superintendent and you want to make some splash, right? You could buy, a couple hundred Chromebooks and put connectivity on them, embed it, or have smart spots. We call them smart spots, but hot spots, and send those home with students. Or you could put internet access on a school bus, and then take that long commute hours and try to recapture them, and you get kind of more impact for those long commutes, and then you do it for athletics and things like that. But the pre-pandemic, there was this need, and at Kajeet, we've been talking about it for forever, but there was this need, and it sort of accepted that was there. When the pandemic happened, all the students went home, and then there was this mass panic to try to find devices. There was certainly a supply issue. There was, how do we deploy them? How do we do all those things that I just listed, right? How do we tech support? How do we do a curriculum that fits in that model, a hybrid model, if nothing else? So there was that. And then after the pandemic, we were sort of disappointed to see a lot of those programs roll back. It's understanding that, if you're going to give somebody a device and they need the device to be able to do schoolwork from home, when school's back in, why do you think they don't need the device anymore? Why do they not need connectivity anymore? So that one I didn't quite get, but we have seen a correction almost in the other direction where they're pulling back on some of those things. Where we haven't seen is on the school buses. That certainly, now that it's E-rate eligible, we have really seen that adoption just continue to increase. They're seeing the functionality of what can happen on the school bus. They're seeing all the benefits of having a school bus. So that's continuing on. Yeah.
Gene, do you think that post-pandemic pullback was largely due to funding or a lack of will or anything like that? Like, can you talk more about, why you think that pullback of some of those programs happened post-pandemic?
I think funding was a good piece of it. I think you nailed it. ECF had 3 waves. They covered a good percentage of that. E-rate on, I think, 18th of July, the USAC is meeting to discuss and vote on whether they should kind of open up E-rate funding for individual smart spots and so forth. But funding was a big piece of it. A lack of will maybe is there as well, where the need assessment was, I think they maybe overdid the need assessment a little bit too. They were sending things home with kids who probably had something already. So there's a little bit of that as well. Yeah.
So I'd like to hear a little bit, well, actually really quick, I just want to clarify E-rate. Now that's the federal funding program, right? And if I understand it correctly, only recently have buses become eligible to take advantage of that to provide connectivity. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. This year. So it's late this year. So the E-rate cycle goes from July the 1st to June the 30th. Mm-hmm. And it came in really late this year. We saw applications for it around, I guess, December, first of December, maybe the end of November. So it was pretty quick cycle. But it certainly, there was high demand. There was a need. It is not 100% covered like ECF is either, because it's just the base E-rate rules, which are based upon need. So a school district will have to pay a percentage, which tells me that, this is something they value, because they are having to contribute some to it as well.
So let's say a school has the funding to be able to provide connectivity through a bus, for example. Can you or David explain then, what does that look like? Like, what does the architecture of that look like? What do they need to have on the bus? What are they connecting? How is that secured? What does that just look like from like an IT perspective?
David, I'll give that one to you, and then I'll add to it.
Right. So with buses, you obviously need a router, right? You need something that'll be able to capture some sort of signal, whether it be a Wi-Fi signal that they're piggybacking off of for the school, if they're in the school lot, or whether it be the cellular connectivity bouncing off the public carrier towers. And from there, they need to really provide a mechanism to provide the internet to the students. So Wi-Fi in some capacity. It might blanket the entire bus. It might. They work out dynamics on how it covers the bus, right? But then on the security side, you definitely don't want people to be able to get into devices that are on the network. So you have your security firewall built in, but then at the same time, you need some security protection so the students aren't getting out to websites that they shouldn't have access to, right? You don't want them to be streaming Netflix when they should actually be doing schoolwork, right? It also affects your data cap, your data usage, and you don't want that to go up exorbitantly. So there's security mechanisms, bidirectional firewalls that'll help protect that, other like CIPA compliance measures that you can put on top of that prevent certain access to things. But at the same time, I mentioned Wi-Fi already. Wi-Fi is used for multiple different reasons. One of them is to piggyback off of in schools when the buses are there, right? Another thing is a lot of buses now are starting to become equipped with cameras, so they can make sure the kids are staying safe and secure. especially on the outside of buses for any potential accidents or just the kids getting on and off the buses, right? Making sure they're going around appropriately and all that. So upload of that video, is can be costly. So they tend to store it locally, and it offloads when it gets back to the depot at the end of the day over Wi-Fi. So a lot of different connectivity use cases in the bus. It probably covers most of the use cases we have connectivity wise with our mobile products.
I would imagine that kind of, when we're talking about physical security, like cameras and that sort of thing, I would imagine that would give some reassurance to the drivers as well, being sometimes the only adult on those buses. I don't know if either of you can speak to, does that impact tenure and being able to keep that staff on?
It does. And also there's cameras that, check for other things, passing cars and from stop. So at Kajeet, we kind of step back and we have a private network, not to talk about Kajeet, but what we found was needed, right, is we have a private network. Our devices use similar to an eSIM, right? So when they're deployed, they can pick up the major carriers and switch over if needed, right? You don't want it switching as it's going down the road. If you need that type of connectivity, we would work with Cradlepoint and put in a second modem and have to do that. But why we chose Cradlepoint is really two reasons. First of all, David mentioned it, the Wi-Fi capabilities, the robust Wi-Fi, those SSIDs. We've integrated NCM into our Sentinel platform so they can control, set SSIDs and passwords, do all that in one pane of glass. Then on the other side of it is the modem side, what's connected to the LTE or 5G network. Very robust, very secure. We rarely have any Cradlepoints come back because you don't want to have to touch the bus or go out of service or anything like that. And we can pull so much information, unique MAC addresses and so forth. I can tell you how many unique student devices connected on a bus at any particular time. And I show all that in Sentinel. So I can tell you everything. I tell you what websites that device went to and everything. And by device, I'm not talking about the router in the aggregate. I'm talking about the individual device the student connected to. I can tell you how much data they use every month and so forth. And then all of ours is built in CIPA-compliant. We have a network-based CIPA compliance. It can add. We can do time of day. So if we have a morning route, I could set it to elementary school, if and then at 10 o'clock switch indicator or higher ed, whatever. So we can do a lot with that. Actually in the network itself. And let's see there's something else I wanted to add about that. I was going to just a little caveat, right? E-rate only pays for the intent of E-rate is to pay for student Wi-Fi. So when you're using it you can use it, as David said, you can use it for other things, cameras or whatever, but you're supposed to allocate whatever percentage, and you have to, there's some variability here, right? You allocate a certain percentage of the data plan if you're using LTE data, and a certain percentage of the router itself upfront cost, if that's your intent. If you're just doing Wi-Fi as WAN offload, you're not using LTE data, but you still need to allocate some of that router itself, that initial purchase that you're going to have to pay for out of pocket because you're using it for non-intended purposes. And then the last thing I'll add is that all of our rate plans are unlimited data. And there's really, you can go to town and, deliver whatever you want to. So,
speaking along those lines, Gene, right? You mentioned that E-rate only covers the student application, right? Student Wi-Fi. Have you found that they're that bringing in those other use cases, cameras, both inside and outside the bus, have reduced cost in other measures, right? Taylor, brought up potential, driver turnover, but like potentially reduced insurance costs or anything along those lines that can help offset those costs as well?
Yeah, it could. I mean, there's a lot of value to video. It not only inside the bus, but outside the bus. Outside the bus is kind of a whole different story. And, one of our partners, Bus Patrol, actually comes in and will work out a program to capture ticket revenue from passing a stop school bus and use that to pay for systems. So it's beautiful, like a turnkey type system. The cameras inside the bus, there's a ton of value there, and I'm sure some of that has to help insurance costs, both inside and outside. But what I've seen on the inside is you're managing situations that have happened, and I've seen this actually sitting in transportation directors' offices. It's hard to meet with them for a long time because they're going to get a call from the principal or from somebody saying, "Hey, 2 days ago." And it's never really real time because it's a fight or whatever. 2 days ago, my student, this happened on the bus. I'm mad. And then they have to go back and look at video and kind of see what happened and then go, move forward from there. So they have to have that data. Their life would just be so miserable without it. So you have to know what happened and so forth. One of the things that we found early on, way pre-pandemic with our deployments of smart bus or Wi-Fi on buses, was customers were telling us that the behavior, they call them behavior referrals, basically, have just tanked, right? When there's Wi-Fi on the bus. Kids don't pick on each other. They're doing homework, right? And the data points. Yeah, well, it's on task. Well, it's not that no cameras. I'm not even talking about cameras. I'm talking about just putting Wi-Fi where they know they have Wi-Fi on the bus, where they can catch up on homework or do whatever, right? Not stream bad things or anything because we filter that out, but the behavior incidents almost go away. And we have some real good, case study information on this. It was crazy. And if you think about a deferral or an issue, right? So the bus driver, you're talking about bus driver retention. A bus driver has to deal with that, and that's got to be stressful, right? Fights and whatever is going on back. If you can reduce that, but when something happens, the bus driver has to, typically they have a camera system, they'll log when it happened, right? So they'll click a button so that it knows that this is where it's at in the tape. Then they have to go talk to the transportation director when they get back. They have to deal with whatever. So then the transportation director has to look at it and then go to the assistant principal. The assistant principal has to review it, has to go to the classroom, pull somebody out of class, which is disruptive for everybody, to bring them in and deal with the parents, most likely, right? That's a lot of time, a lot of money spent for something that we've seen reduced by just putting Wi-Fi on the bus.
Gene, you talked a lot about the importance of having, especially for a fleet. So if we're talking about connecting school buses to be able to provide internet access to students, having a cloud management system for that fleet is so valuable, and the data and reporting that come with that, and just the data plans. I think those are all aspects that are important for sites as well. And I'm curious to hear from you guys what role cellular might play in connectivity for school campuses. Is it just on the buses that we're seeing cellular play a role, or is that being extended into classrooms and sporting events and that sort of thing? Where else are we seeing it?
What I've seen, and David may have more data on this, but what I've seen from our perspective is backup, right, for your primary internet circuit. So we're using Cradle point routers. We're dropping on one per school almost, and just plugging it into the existing router. And then when that circuit fails, it will roll over to the Cradle point and our LTE coverage or 5G. Also for that matter with the rate plans and so forth, you could even segment some traffic off as well. If you want a certain type of traffic that you pass every day, go ahead and send it over to LTE. I've been in schools, talking to teachers and so forth, and they say, I can't stand our Wi-Fi network. It's so slow. So there's a capability to go ahead and just push some traffic over to that. So that's on campus, is what I've seen. And that's kind of all that I've seen from a cellular standpoint. It's just backup things, right? Everything else that's on campus is going through LoRa or, some or Wi-Fi for that matter. In my experience, which is not, it is what it is. Off campus though, there is a huge demand. I'm seeing more and more of this we sell a kit that has a battery built in, and it takes a credit point router, and you don't even have to open the kit. You just press a button, you charge it, and it sets up a network for you. So we're seeing a lot of those going out for either really remote classrooms where it's sort of dynamic and you're not going to be there all the time, right? If you're there all the time, we could install a router and make it work all the time. But we're also seeing those for sporting events, as you mentioned. Athletic directors may take one on a bus they don't use much and don't want to install it. So we are seeing a lot of that. It's also good if it's a sunny day and you want to take your class outside somewhere.
David, have you seen any other use cases that are off bus?
Yeah. So, well, I'm going to start with on bus first. So during COVID, some of the, what we'll call it, underpowered areas, right, where they don't have robust networks around, they would take their buses and they would park them in neighborhoods for kids to be able to actually leverage the Wi-Fi from those buses to get online during COVID, right? So that's keeping it on bus. So off of bus and back into the schools, I think Gene kind of hit it right on the head where you've got teachers and everything complaining of, weak Wi-Fi or poor Wi-Fi. And you think of a traditional school, and I'm going to go to my kid's school that's up the street here. They've got, we'll call it 1,200 kids in the building that are all using their tablets and everything to do their schoolwork now, because a lot of ours kept that digital connectivity when they went back to schools. They didn't revert back to the books. Now, mind you, it's elementary school. Kids gravitate to the digital, right? But when you have that many kids using the Wi-Fi, unless you have access points in every single room, which, mind you, they do have an access point in every single room, unless you have them in every single room, your Wi-Fi is going to be weak. It's going to be poor. It's going to be saturated. So we're actually starting to see some more of the private networks come into the school environments where some of the overhead, so teachers and administrators will have a handheld where they can get in touch with people throughout the school and stuff. Those will use Wi-Fi. With these private networks, they can get a private network version of these, a private cellular version of these, to get off that Wi-Fi network to stay in touch with everyone, for the administration also. For other ancillary connections that just Wi-Fi is not cutting it anymore, to provide a little extra bandwidth for the kids, but also to have that sort of a backup solution for things going down. But private networks is really starting to come out more. These are just early use cases. I'm sure as things start to shift over, more will be leveraging these private cellular, because one of the advantages of the private cellular is you get to define exactly who's on the network. It's no longer I have a username and password. It's, does that SIM have the ability to connect to the network or not? So it adds another layer of security, another layer of digital security, wireless security to those networks. So it's going to help further secure the students when they're learning on campus once we get to that point. I mean, we're still early on with a lot of them, but there's a lot of interest. There's tests out there for a lot of different use cases. We kind of need the handsets and the other devices to support it, but we're getting there. It's starting to get there for sure.
Yeah, that's a great point, David. We also have a business unit that builds private networks. With some partnerships with Ericsson, but we build private networks, and we're seeing higher ed right now is adopting this. It makes a lot of sense for them, and it's working quite well on a campus like that. So, but I totally agree. I think we're headed that way. It's just the economics have to work, and that it's just in some cases it may not quite be there for a K-12 school district, which is another concern across the board for that sector is funding is being squeezed. A lot of there's a push as you've seen to move kids to private schools. There's certain factions that said we shouldn't. I shouldn't have to pay for public school because I don't have any kids that go, right. So there's certainly funding concerns that are there. So which goes across the board with everything that we talked about. Now I think both of you were asking this, like, hey, what is the return on investment and what are the things that tie in there, which is so important, like the total. Is it going to reduce insurance cost? Is it, does it give us more academic hours, right? Because there's value to that. Could you cut some days off the school year of actually being inside the facility with all the power and lights and the staff that supports the facility? Some staff only supports the facility, it has nothing to do with students, right?
Yeah, I mean that's interesting, right? Is both you and David have said kind of similar things, right? When Taylor and I talk to, other customers that are typically in not necessarily public sector, right? They're in private sector. The funny thing is a lot of the same things resonate in the same ways, just a little bit differently, right? It's like the whole remote hybrid work thing that I think we're all familiar with being in the workforce, right? Has reduced the cost of office space. And if school districts think about that similarly, right, is something that you said, right, is like, is there an opportunity to reduce their facility costs, either the size of the facility or the facility support staff, or, I hate to talk about it in those terms because those are real people's jobs as well. But, it's one of those things where it's like, could you have a hybrid learning where only a certain portion of the kids are in person each day, right, where it's like you alternate. David, you talked about private cellular. One of the other interesting use cases I saw during the pandemic as well was not just offloading staff connectivity, which is interesting. That's definitely something I hadn't heard before. But, typically the schools only service a defined geographical area around the building. And so what I saw some during the pandemic was people deploying private cellular networks, not for the building itself, but to provide that connectivity to those devices in that geographic area, right? Because it's not like a macro network where they're having to blanket everyone everywhere. They only have to blanket within a few miles of that building. Well, depending on the density of the setting, right? Some rural schools might have a bigger area, but especially in urban settings, the density of that is usually within a mile or so. And so being able to use that private cellular network to blanket those underserved areas was definitely a use case that I felt a certain passion about as well during that time, because it offered the ability for those kids who wouldn't normally have that access to have that access. But you're right, Gene, that a lot of these ideas, while laudable and great, really come down to that public will around funding, because education is one of those things that we have to fund because it's the right thing to do, not because we think we're going to get a return on investment, which ultimately we will, because these kids are going to grow up and be adults and be in the workforce and productive members of society. But that's a long-term investment. Yeah, cross your fingers, right? Yeah, my daughter just graduated high school. I'm hoping that she is a productive member of society. But it's one of those things where you can't think of near-term terms, and just because people want private school to be better doesn't necessarily mean it is going to be better. So it's one of those things where it seems like, we as a society just have to remember we have to exercise that public good sometimes.
Speaking your point about the private networks and reaching out, school districts are one of the easiest ones, I think, to build as far as infrastructure, or municipalities for that matter, because they own buildings and assets around, and then they're tied in with municipalities or counties that have water towers, and so the infrastructure cost, the leasing and so forth is certainly easier when you're dealing with the school district.
I would love to just kind of, philosophize a little bit, or just like think in some good terms. If finances and probably politics were not a barrier to entry, what do each of you think could happen if cellular connectivity was prevalent for all students, or for just for all students, what could potentially happen to the education system or to even advancements in educational technology? What do you see that as? I
would say that we would have a good future as a country, and we could keep up. I just think that's table stakes, really. Everybody should have an opportunity to be able to do that. I mean, even outside of students, you should be able to have a computer that you can look up a job or take a class or do any of that kind of thing, research.
So, I mean, for me, it kind of, I'm going to take a little bit of a historical approach and come back to the forward. So when I was in school, we didn't have Wi-Fi, right? The closest thing I had to a computer was an Apple II GS. And we took typing classes, air quoting here, typing classes on a typewriter, not even a computer, on a typewriter, right? So a lot of what we had to learn was in books. Now the books make you definitely retain your knowledge better when you have a physical book that you're working from, but your availability to access more materials is infinitely better when you have that connectivity medium, right? So being able to bring that cellular in to connect to information everywhere is definitely a bonus, because it lets you see other points of view. It lets you see other things that are happening throughout the world. It lets you get access to data and information a lot more prevalently. So while my kids have that great access now, I also worry that they have too much access. Now, mind you, they're young, 8 and 11, but they kind of know their boundaries, right? Which is nice because we put them there. So, but as they get older, they're going to have more access to everything. And I think it's great because having that informational access, especially for the curious, wanting to get more information and wanting to learn more, it's just exceptional. It's phenomenal.
Absolutely. Well, Gene and David, thank you for carving time out of your schedules to talk to us about just cellular technology and education. This topic is so important and so top of mind for so many people that are listening too, whether you're a parent or you're in IT, it applies to so many different sectors. Before we let you go, Gene, can you tell our listeners where they can learn more about Kajeet and the work that you do?
Yes, ma'am, certainly. So the simplest thing is our website, which is just Kajeet.com, Kajeet.com. And there you can go in. We have all sorts of information, some on digital equity, of course, and the education sides, private networks. You can click links, there's videos and so forth. If you want to find out more information from that, then there's a link where somebody you could chat or someone could contact you or whatever. And it's not salesy. We certainly are try to share knowledge that we have, that we've seen, and help come up with solutions.
Well, you've personified that. We've appreciated you sharing your knowledge today with us.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Cradle Point.
One thing that I appreciated that Gene shared with us was kind of this checklist of, do you have connectivity? Do you have hardware? And those were, in my mind, I'm like, yeah, that's really all you need is connectivity and hardware, and then you're set. But then when he started talking about, well, the curriculum is kind of a no-brainer, but digital citizenship and then tech support, I, for some reason, and I probably should have asked him more about this, but I hadn't thought too much about that, because there is one thing. It's one thing to get this connectivity to students who maybe don't always have access to it. But there's this whole other element of, okay, well, what if they encounter a problem? And do they have access to that help? And it's just kind of like this onion of things that we need to make sure we can provide to help get education to the folks that need it.
Yeah, 100%. You think about it, right, is I like how they put it down in terms of what was going on before the pandemic, what happened during the pandemic, and what's going on after, right? Because pre-pandemic, you think about it as like the Chromebook or the iPad in the classroom was a novelty. It was there. The teachers would use it. If it didn't work, they would throw it in a corner and not use it, right? And the IT staff at the schools, was really mostly dedicated to ensuring the administrative connectivity and the teachers' connectivity to do grades and whatnot. And then just like here in business where we had to scramble to immediately go to work from home, they had to scramble to do learn from home. Not only did they have to figure out how to get the kids a device and connectivity for those that didn't have it, but then the teachers had to completely change their educational methodologies, right? They went from strictly teaching in person to teaching, virtually. For us, it wasn't that big of a leap to go from a meeting in a conference room to a meeting at Zoom. But imagine trying to engage 30 kids who don't necessarily want to be there or be engaged, and that's difficult enough in person where you can see them and communicate with them and see whether the things are landing or they're not paying attention, to Zoom where they could potentially just turn off their camera and just be, gone and doing whatever. So that was definitely, that is, I think, something that not a lot of people thought about. But then not only that, not just the support from the schools, but you think about the parents who didn't necessarily grow up with technology, or if they already were in an area that was underserved, don't have those technical skills. So their kids are the ones who have the technical skills. So imagine handing a hotspot or something to that. And then when there's having issues, the parents will help them. The parents don't have those skills. So not only delivering those devices, but then delivering the instructions to the parents in a manner that makes sense to them. So it was also very interesting to me. I'm glad David brought it up because it was one of the ones that it was a use case that I was particularly excited about when I saw during the pandemic. And that's where the school districts figured out that they had this huge asset that was just sitting there collecting dust during the pandemic. And so they took those buses out and they rolled them out into underserved areas and parked them and then just turned on the Wi-Fi. Even today, even with them back in classes, like the buses are sitting in a bus yard for, 16 hours a day, 12, 16 hours a day, not being used for anything. I understand that there's security concerns and some of these impoverished areas are also potentially high crime areas or near high crime areas. So there's a concern there. But, if they can overcome those things with potentially other use cases like cameras on the bus, that could potentially be a huge, game changer for some of these kids that don't live in underserved areas. Not only that, if they could figure out a good way to extend that connectivity to other people in those areas, it could be a game changer for everyone in those areas. Yeah, the full community. It could be a game changer to help uplift some of those communities. So, one of the things I'm passionate about that is my background. I was in one of those kids. I was one of those kids that was in an underserved area. And so for me, just like people who think outside the box and bring new ideas to address some of those issues that people don't necessarily want to talk about or people don't want to fix, is just, to me, is super exciting to have people who think in those terms. It's like, how can I utilize this in a different way to change the course of someone's life?
And one thing that gives me hope is that the use of cellular is getting easier and easier. It's already fairly simple, but it just keeps getting easier and the security keeps getting better, right? And we've talked so much about zero trust and whatnot on our podcast. And so I think that these use cases just become no-brainers more often than not. And hopefully we keep seeing them expand.
Yeah, I think one of the things, though, I do want to hint on, because I think I've said it like probably 3 or 4 times on the podcast that I just want to remind everybody about is David brought it up, is using private cellular where it makes sense, right? They're using it to offload the administrative network and making that sense. It's one of those things where it's the right connectivity for the right use case at the right time. And so it's not just, Wi-Fi is not working. It was like, well, what else can we do? Can I put up a wired network? Can I put up a Wi-Fi network? Can I put up a private cellular network? How can I address this in a different way? So I think more than anything across every topic we've ever talked about, I think that's it, is how can I use something in a different way? Or how can I make sure that I'm using the right technology to solve the right problem at the right time?
Well said. If you enjoyed this conversation about school connectivity, share it with a friend or a parent or a teacher or anyone. Then rate and subscribe to What's Your Signal wherever you listen to podcasts.